Somewhere tonight, in a dark house, in a town you have never heard of, a phone is going to ring after midnight. On one end, there will be a tired woman with a list of names and nowhere left to send a boy. On the other end, there will be somebody in a bathrobe, squinting at a screen, doing the arithmetic that nobody ever teaches you how to do. Let that be the picture you drift off to. I promise you, it is not a sad one. Get comfortable, turn the lamp down, and let me tell you a slow story about a trash bag full of clothes, a plate of pancakes, and a bedroom door that was never once locked. The woman in the bathrobe was named Diane. She was 62 years old, and she lived with her husband Gary in a 1960s ranch house on the edge of a town outside Fort Wayne, Indiana, on a street where the same 9 families had been trading snow shovels and casseroles for 30 years. Diane had worked 29 years as the secretary at the middle school. If you have never thought about what a school secretary actually is, let me tell you, because it is not typing. A middle school secretary is the person who keeps a drawer of granola bars for the kids who did not eat, and a bin of gym shorts for the ones who never bring them, and who knows before anybody else does when a house has gone bad, because a child who is not sleeping shows up at that front desk before they show up anywhere else. She had raised 2 of her own in that ranch house. Steph, who was 34 now, and lived in Indianapolis with a job in insurance and no particular plans to have children. And Kevin, 31, who had gone into the Army at 19 and stayed, and who called every other Sunday from Colorado, and whose bedroom Diane had finally, 4 years ago, painted over. That is the house the phone rang in. 2 people, 1 dog, and 2 empty bedrooms with the doors closed. Now, the reason that phone rang in that particular house is a story of its own. And I want to tell you that part first because otherwise the rest of it will sound like an accident. 2 years before this, on an ordinary Thursday in April, a 7th grader had come through Diane's office at 8 in the morning and sat down in the chair by the copier and would not go to class. His name was Dominic. He was 12. He had been in the same clothes for 4 days, and he had a smell to him that Diane had learned to recognize a long time ago. And when the counselor finally got him talking, it turned out there had been nobody in his house since Sunday. Diane sat with that boy for 6 hours. 6. She got him a sandwich from the cafeteria and a clean shirt out of the lost and found bin, and she let him play a game on her computer. And she made phone calls, and the counselor made phone calls, and the caseworker who eventually came made phone calls. And at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the caseworker stood in the doorway of that little office and said, out loud, to nobody, "We do not have a bed for him." Not, "We are looking." Not, "It will take a few hours." We do not have a bed. In the whole county. For a 12-year-old boy who had been alone in a house since Sunday. They found him something at 9 that night. Diane never learned exactly what or where. She went home and made dinner, and did not eat any of it. And at 10:30, she was sitting at the kitchen table with her reading glasses on, filling out a form on a laptop. And Gary came in and looked over her shoulder and said, "Huh." That is the entire conversation those two had about it. 38 years of marriage. He said, "Huh." And then he said, "Well, we would have to fix that back bathroom." And then he went to bed. They took the classes. That is a thing people do not know about. So let me tell you what it actually involves, because it is not a weekend and a handshake. It was 10 weeks of Tuesday evenings in a conference room at the county office, with coffee in a carafe and a binder each. They learned about trauma and what it does to a developing brain. They learned about what happens to a child who has moved 11 times before high school. They learned the difference between a kid who is defying you and a kid whose whole nervous system is convinced that the room is on fire. There were background checks. There were fingerprints. There was a woman who came out to the house and looked at the water heater and the smoke detectors and asked where the medications were kept and made them install a lock on a cabinet Diane had not locked in 3 decades. And then, when all of it was done and the certificate came in the mail, and they had a spare room with fresh paint and a bed with a quilt on it, absolutely nothing happened for 4 months. That is the part nobody puts in the movies. 4 months of a made-up bed. Diane would walk past that door on her way to the laundry and think, well, maybe they lost our paperwork. The first placement was 2 little girls, 4 and 6, for 9 days, until an aunt in Kentucky got approved. Diane cried for a week after that one. And then she washed the sheets and made the bed again. The second was a baby, 6 weeks old, for a weekend. The third was a boy named Owen, and the phone rang at 11:40 at night on a Tuesday in March, and Diane was already asleep. The caseworker's name was Yvonne. She had been doing that job for 9 years, which is about 7 years longer than most people last, and she had the particular flat voice people get when they have said something difficult too many times in 1 week. She said, "Diane, I am sorry to do this to you at this hour." Diane sat up and turned on the lamp and said, "Tell me." He was 16. 16 is the number that ends most of these phone calls, and Yvonne knew it, and she said it fast and then waited. He had been in 11 placements in 5 years. He was currently sitting in a chair in the lobby of the county office, where he had been since 4 in the afternoon, because the group home he had been in since January had given notice on him, and there were 2 respite beds in the county, and both of them had somebody in them. Yvonne said, "I am asking for 2 weeks, 3 at the outside. I have a therapeutic placement opening the 1st of April, and I want him in it. But I cannot put a 16-year-old in my office overnight, and I have run out of numbers to call." Now here is what Diane knew, sitting on the edge of her bed at 11:40 at night, because she had sat in that conference room for 10 Tuesdays and taken notes. She knew that a boy with 11 placements in 5 years has been sent back 11 times. She knew that whatever had happened in the first house was only the beginning of what had happened to him. Because the system that catches you can also drop you, over and over, until being dropped is the only thing you count on. And she knew that 2 weeks is a promise, and that a kid like that can hear a promise coming from 3 rooms away and can tell you exactly how much it is worth. Gary was awake by then. He was lying there with his arm over his eyes, and he said, without moving, "Tell her yes." Diane said, "Yes, 2 weeks." She would tell you now, all these years later, that she meant it when she said it. That is important. She was not being clever. She was a woman who had already sat with one boy in an office chair for 6 hours, and she was not going to leave another one in a lobby. Yvonne said thank you. She said, "I will have him there in 40 minutes. And then she said, "Diane, he is not going to talk to you. Do not take it personally." He came in at 17 minutes past midnight. There was a state car in the driveway with its headlights on, and Yvonne got out one side, and a young man got out the other. And Diane, standing at the storm door in a cardigan over her nightgown, had to adjust her whole idea of what she was looking at. Because 16 on a piece of paper and 16 standing in your driveway at midnight are 2 different things. He was tall, 6'1" maybe, and thin the way boys are thin at that age, with a hooded sweatshirt and a jaw set so hard you could see the muscle in it from the porch. And he was carrying a black plastic trash bag over one shoulder, the kind you put leaves in, with the top twisted shut in his fist. Diane had been warned about the trash bag in her classes. There is a whole section about it. There are charities that hand out duffel bags for exactly this reason. She had heard about it, and she had nodded, and she had written it down, and none of that did one single thing to prepare her for standing in her own doorway, watching a boy carry his entire life up her driveway in something you buy in a box of 40. She did not say anything about it. That was the first decision she made, and she made it in about a second and a half. And I think it might have been the most important one in this whole story. She did not say, "Oh, honey." She did not reach for the bag. She did not put a hand on his back. She said, "I am Diane. There is a bathroom at the end of the hall, and there is food in the kitchen. Do you want to see the room, or do you want to eat first?" He looked at her for maybe 3 seconds. Then he said, "The room." That was the entire first conversation. 4 words from him. The room had been Kevin's. It was painted a pale gray blue now, and there was a bed with a quilt Diane's mother had made, and a dresser, and a desk with a lamp, and a window that looked out at the side yard and the neighbor's barn. Owen stood in the middle of it with the bag still on his shoulder and looked at everything the way you look at a hotel room you are not sure you can afford. Then he said, "What are the rules?" Yvonne, in the hall behind them, went very still, because that question is not really a question. That question is a boy handing you a script and asking you to read your part. And Diane said, "Well, I have not thought about it much." That was true, by the way. She was 62, and it was after midnight. She said, "The one rule is that I need to know where you are. Not why, not who with, just where, and roughly when you are coming back. That is it. That one I need." He waited for the rest. She said, "That is the rest." He said, "There is always more than that." And Diane said, "Probably. We will find out. I am going to bed, and there is cereal, and there is bread, and there is lunch meat, and you can have any of it at any hour without asking me." Then she said good night, and she went to bed, and she lay there in the dark next to her husband, wide awake, listening to a stranger move around in her son's old room. He did not unpack the bag. That is the detail I want you to hold on to, because it ran under everything for the next 4 months. Diane cleared him 2 drawers and half a closet, and the trash bag stayed on the floor at the foot of the bed with the top twisted shut. Every morning she would walk past that open door on the way to the coffee pot and see it sitting there like a suitcase in an airport. And every morning she would decide, again, not to mention it. He slept on top of the covers for the first 9 nights, fully dressed, shoes lined up beside the bed, laces loose, pointing at the door. There are people who would look at that and see a kid who is difficult. Diane had sat in a conference room for 10 Tuesdays, and she knew exactly what she was looking at, which was a boy who had been woken up and moved in the middle of the night enough times that his body had made a decision about it without asking him. She did not mention that either. She just, on the 12th day, put a second quilt over the back of the chair in his room, and said nothing. And 3 nights later, she noticed the shoes were under the bed instead of beside it. That is how it went. That is the whole pace of this story. So if you are waiting for something to blow up, let me tell you now that it does. Once. and then it does not again. And mostly what happens in this house happens at about the speed of a season changing. The food was the first real thing. About 2 weeks in, Diane went to strip the bed while he was at school, which she had told him she would do, and which he had shrugged at. And when she pulled the mattress out from the wall, there was a hollow spot behind the headboard with 7 granola bars in it, 4 bags of chips, 6 of those little cups of applesauce, and 2 apples that had gone soft. She sat down on the floor of that bedroom and put her hand over her mouth. Because here is the thing about a boy hoarding food in a house where nobody has ever once told him he could not eat. It is not about this house. It is a report from a much older house, filed late. She had 3 choices, and she knew it, because they had done this exact scenario in week 6 of the classes with a woman named Charlotte who had fostered for 22 years. She could confront him about it, which would humiliate him. She could quietly clean it out, which would tell him that even the food he hid was not his. Or she could do the third thing. She went to the store. She bought one of those wire baskets, the kind you would put fruit in on a counter, and she filled it with the granola bars and the chips and the applesauce cups, and a few things she had noticed he liked. And she put it on his desk, and she left the ones behind the headboard exactly where they were. She never said a word about it. Not that week, not that year, not ever, not even when he was 24 and brought it up himself at her kitchen table and had to stop halfway through the sentence. She just refilled the basket on Sundays, the way you would fill a bird feeder, and eventually, sometime in the summer, she noticed the basket was going down slower. And sometime after that, she noticed there was nothing behind the headboard anymore. The 2 weeks came and went. Yvonne called on the 10th day. The therapeutic placement had fallen through, which is a thing that happens more than anybody wants to say out loud. And there was another one in the pipeline for June, and she was sorry, and could Diane hold on a little longer? Diane said yes without checking with Gary, and then felt bad about not checking, and told him at dinner. And Gary said, well, he is already here. But she made a mistake that week, a small one, and an honest one, and it cost her about 2 months. She told Owen. She sat him down at the kitchen table like an adult and told him the truth, which was that the plan had changed, and he would be staying past the 2 weeks and probably until June. She thought she was respecting him. She thought she was being straight with him, which was the thing he seemed to want most in the world. And she watched his face close, like a hand closing. Because what he heard was not, you get to stay longer. What he heard was, June. What he heard was a date. And a boy who has been moved 11 times does not hear a date as information. He hears it as a countdown. For the next several weeks he was polite. That was the worst of it, honestly. He was polite the way a guest is polite in a house they are not going to see again. He said thank you for dinner. He took his plate to the sink. He stopped leaving his shoes anywhere at all. And he stopped touching the basket. Gary was the one who noticed that. Gary, who had said perhaps 40 words to the boy in 6 weeks, mostly about the truck and the weather, came in from the garage one evening and said to his wife, quietly, that basket has not moved since Tuesday. I want to tell you about Gary for a minute, because he is easy to miss in this story, and because he did something in the 2nd month that I think about a lot. Gary was 64. He had spent 31 years on the county road crew, and he had hands that looked like they had been left out in the weather. And he was not a talker. He was one of those Midwestern men who conducts almost his entire emotional life through equipment. He did not sit Owen down. He never once asked that boy a question about his feelings. What he did instead was one Saturday in April, walk into the kitchen where Owen was doing nothing at the table and say, "The mower is not turning over, and I cannot see what I am doing anymore. Come hold a light for me." That was it. Come hold a light for me. They were out there 2 hours. Diane looked out the window over the sink about 4 times, and every time the two of them were bent over that mower deck, and every time the boy was closer in. At some point, Owen said, "That is not the plug. That is the fuel line." And Gary, who had known perfectly well it was the fuel line for about 20 minutes, said, "Huh, show me." That was the beginning of it. After that, there was always something in that garage that needed a second pair of hands. A brake job on the truck, a door that would not hang right, the snowblower in a month when nobody needs a snowblower. Owen was good at it, really good, in the way that surprises everybody except the kid, who has known since he was 9 that machines make sense and people do not. And still, all through that spring, the trash bag sat at the foot of the bed with the top twisted shut. Now I have to tell you about the night in May, because it is the hinge this whole thing turns on, and because if you are lying there half asleep waiting for the part where somebody yells, this is it, and it is not what you think. It started over nothing. It always does. There was a school thing, a spring awards night, and Diane had signed up to bring a pan of brownies, and had mentioned, in passing, at dinner, that she and Gary would be going. Owen said, "Why?" Diane said, "Because you are getting a certificate in the shop class." He said, "It is a piece of paper." She said, "I know. We are still going." And something in the room changed temperature. He got up from the table and put his plate in the sink and said, with his back to her, in a voice that was very flat and very careful, "You do not have to do that." She said, "I know I do not have to." He said, "June is in 3 weeks." And there it was, the countdown, out loud for the first time. Diane said, "Owen," and he turned around, and this boy who had been polite for 2 months said, "Do not come. Seriously. Do not sit there with the parents. It is embarrassing." And then he said the thing he had been holding in his mouth since March. He said, "You are not my mom." Now, there is a version of this story where a woman gets her feelings hurt at that sentence. Diane's feelings were not hurt, and I want to be precise about why, because it is the whole engine of what she did next. She had been a school secretary for 29 years. She had watched 1,000 13-year-olds say the ugliest thing they could reach for at the exact moment they most needed somebody to stay in the room. She knew a test when it was handed to her. She said, "No, I am not." And then she said, "I am still bringing brownies." He went to his room. And an hour later, when she went down the hall to say good night, the door was open, and the boy was sitting on the end of the bed with his coat on, and the trash bag was in his lap. He had packed. There had been almost nothing to pack because he had never unpacked, and that was the point. He said without looking up, "You can call her tonight. It is fine. I have done it before." And Diane, 62 years old, in the hallway of her own house, understood something she had heard in a conference room 2 years earlier and had not really believed until that second. He was not leaving because she had failed. He was leaving first. Because he had learned that being sent is survivable if you are already standing up with your bag in your hand when it happens, and unsurvivable if you are asleep under a quilt and somebody wakes you at 11 at night. She did not argue with him. She did not say, "Nobody is sending you anywhere," which is the sentence every adult in his life had used, and which had been true exactly none of the time. She came into the room and sat down on the end of the bed next to him, and she put her hands in her lap, and she looked out the window at the neighbor's barn for a while. Then she said, "That is a good bag. It has held up." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. She said, "I am not going to promise you June. I do not run June. Yvonne does not run June either, if we are being honest. A judge runs June, and I have never met a judge in my life." She said, "Here is what I have got. Tomorrow morning there are pancakes, because it is Saturday, and I make them on Saturday whether anybody eats them or not. And the awards thing is Thursday, and I will be in the third row with a pan of brownies, and it will be embarrassing." And then she said the sentence that this boy would repeat, word for word, 8 years later, standing up in front of 150 people with a microphone in his hand. She said, "You can keep the bag packed as long as you need to. I am not going to ask you to unpack it. But you should know that the door on this room does not lock, and it is not going to. And nobody in this house is going to come through it at 11 at night and tell you to get up." Then she said good night and went to bed. In the morning, she made pancakes for 4 people, out of habit, which was 2 too many, and Gary read the paper. And at 9:15, Owen came down the hall and sat at the table and ate 6 of them. His coat was off. The bag was still packed. But it had moved from the middle of the floor to the corner by the closet, and it stayed there for another 5 weeks. And then one day in the middle of June, Diane walked past the open door on the way to the laundry, and the bag was gone. She looked for it. She could not help herself. She found it, eventually, folded up in the bottom drawer of the dresser, underneath his clothes. Folded, not thrown out. She left it there. It is still there tonight, as a matter of fact, in the bottom drawer of a dresser in a gray-blue room in a ranch house outside Fort Wayne. And I will tell you at the end of this what it is doing there. June came, the way June does. Yvonne called on a Wednesday to say the therapeutic placement had opened up. A good one, she said, and she meant it. Staff trained in exactly the kind of thing Owen had been through. A clinician on site. A school program built for kids who had lost credits moving. On paper, it was better than a ranch house with 2 retired people and a beagle. And Diane, who had been holding this conversation in her head for 6 weeks, said the thing she had decided to say, which was, "That is his to answer, not mine." Yvonne was quiet for a second. Then she said, "You understand he is 16. And Diane said, "I do." And Yvonne said, "All right, put him on." Here is a thing most people do not know, and it matters, so I'm going to slow down for it. In this country, once a kid in care is old enough, the system starts having to ask them. Not about everything, but about the big ones. In most states, a child over the age of 14 has to consent to their own adoption. A judge will ask them, out loud, in a courtroom, and if that young person says no, then no is the answer. That sounds small. It is not small. For a boy who had been moved 11 times by other people's phone calls, the first time anybody handed him the receiver was a Wednesday afternoon in June in a kitchen in Indiana. He listened for a long time. He said, "Okay," 4 times. He said, "Can I think about it?" And Yvonne said, "Of course." And he said, "No, actually." And then he stood there with the phone against his ear, looking at the window over the sink, and Diane made herself walk out of that kitchen and stand in the hallway where she could not see his face. He said, "I would rather stay here." And then he said, "If that is okay." Diane, in the hallway, put her hand flat on the wall. That is the whole scene. Nobody cried. He hung up and went out to the garage, where Gary had a lawnmower deck up on blocks that had not needed anything doing to it for a week and a half. The summer he was 16 was, by the standards of this story, uneventful. And I want to give you all of it anyway, because uneventful is the entire prize. That is the thing nobody tells you about kids like Owen. What they're missing is not drama. What they're missing is a long, boring stretch of days in a row that look the same. Pancakes on Saturday, corn on the cob from the neighbor's garden in August, a beagle named Duke, 12 years old and mostly deaf, who developed an unshakable opinion that Owen's bed was his bed, and who would be waiting on it every night at 9, and who could not be reasoned with. I have to say something about the dog, because Diane will tell you that Duke did more work that summer than anybody. That boy could not be hugged, could not stand a hand on his shoulder, would go rigid at it. But a deaf old beagle who cannot read a room and simply lies down on your legs and goes to sleep is a different proposition entirely. Diane would walk past the door at 11 at night and see her 16-year-old lying on top of the quilt with a dog across his shins, scratching that dog's ear in the dark. And she would go to bed and lie there, feeling like something enormous was happening very quietly, one room away. And there was the driving. Now, I am going to tell you the unglamorous version of this, because the way people imagine it and the way it actually goes are two different things. A teenager in foster care getting a driver's license is a genuine bureaucratic knot. Somebody has to sign. Somebody has to insure. For years, that was where it died, because a foster parent could not always sign, and the state was not going to insure a 16-year-old. And so kids aged out at 18 with no license, no car, and no way to get to the job they were suddenly supposed to have. Indiana had a program by then. Most states have some version now. There was a form and a fund that helps with the insurance, and Yvonne knew the exact person to call. And it took about 5 weeks and 3 signatures and 1 afternoon in a plastic chair at the license branch. But before any of that, there was a church parking lot on Sunday afternoons, and a 1998 pickup with a manual transmission, and Gary in the passenger seat with a thermos of coffee saying almost nothing. He stalled it 9 times the first day. Gary drank his coffee. On the 10th, Owen got it rolling, and he took that truck in one long, slow circle around the light poles at about 4 miles an hour, and Gary said, "There it is." That is all he said. There it is. By the end of July, the boy could drive that truck better than Diane could, which Gary mentioned at dinner exactly once, and which Diane has never let him forget. School started in August, and school was the hard part, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. Owen was 16, and he was, by credit count, a sophomore. 11 placements means 11 schools, or near enough, and every move costs a kid part of a semester, and nobody ever gives it back. He had gaps in his transcript that nobody could account for. He had a whole year of English that had simply evaporated somewhere in a district 2 hours south. Diane, of course, was a school secretary for 29 years, and if you have ever wondered whether it helps to have somebody on your side who knows exactly which office to sit down in and refuse to leave, let me tell you, it helps enormously. She got the transcript pulled apart line by line. She found a credit recovery program that ran 2 nights a week at the Career Center. She sat in a meeting with a counselor who suggested, gently, that Owen might simply want to look at a high school equivalency test instead. And she said, "No thank you, he is going to walk across a stage." And then she came home, and did not tell him she had said it, because he would have hated it. The Career Center was the thing that actually turned it. 2 afternoons a week, a program in heating and cooling, taught by a man named Doyle, who had run his own company for 22 years before he got tired of the paperwork and started teaching kids instead. Doyle called Diane in October, which is not a call you expect to enjoy. He said, "I have got your boy in 4th period." She said, "Is there a problem?" And Doyle said, "No, man. I have got 22 kids in that lab, and 19 of them are there because their counselor put them there. Your boy takes the manuals home. I have never seen anybody take the manuals home." He said, "I am going to give him a key to the tool room. I wanted you to hear it from me first, in case that is a problem." And Diane said, "Why would it be a problem?" And Doyle said, "Some folks in your situation would not want a kid with his file having a key." There was a silence on the phone. Then Diane said, "Mr. Doyle, do you know what he did the last week of August?" "He rewired the light in my pantry that has not worked since Kevin was in high school. Did not tell me he was doing it. I opened the door, and there was light in there." She said, "Give him the key." Now I want to tell you about his mother, and I want to do it carefully, because this is a story with no villain in it, and I intend to keep it that way. Her name was Rhonda. She was 43. Owen had been removed from her house when he was 11, and her rights had been terminated when he was 13, which is a legal phrase that sounds like a door slamming and is actually more like a long hallway with a lot of hearings in it. She was not cruel. She was not a monster. She had an illness that arrived in her 20s the way weather arrives, and it took her thinking away from her in pieces. And she had stretches where she was almost entirely herself, and stretches where she was not reachable at all. And the 11-year-old boy in that apartment had been the one buying groceries with whatever was in the drawer. That is not a villain. That is a tragedy with 2 people standing in it, and one of them was a child. Owen never talked about her. Not once. Not in 6 months. Diane never asked, because she had been told in week 4 of those classes that you do not go fishing in a child's worst year for your own understanding. And then, in September, out of nowhere, at the kitchen table, with a bowl of chili in front of him, he said, "Is it weird if I want to see her?" Diane put her spoon down and said, "No." That was it. That was her whole answer. She has told me since that it took everything she had not to say more, and that the not saying more was the entire job. It took 6 weeks to arrange. There is a process, there are people who supervise these things, and the facility she was in at the time was 2 hours south. On a Saturday in the first week of November, Diane drove him down in the good car, and they did not talk much, and she parked and said, "I will be right here." And she meant right here, in this parking spot, for as long as it takes. He was inside for 50 minutes. He came out and got in the car and put his seatbelt on and looked straight ahead and said, "She thought I was 13. And then he said, "She asked if I had a coat." And Diane, who had 1,000 things she could have said none of them. She reached over and turned the heat up and pulled out of that lot and drove her boy to a Dairy Queen, 40 minutes north. And they sat in a parking lot in November, eating ice cream in a running car. Because that is what you do in the Midwest when there is nothing to say. He saw her twice a year after that. He still does. Diane never once made a face about it. And I think that is the second most important decision in this story. Here is where the story turns, and it turns in the least dramatic way imaginable. In a car, in the dark, in February. They were coming back from the career center. Owen had his permit by then. He was driving. Diane was in the passenger seat. And the heat in that old truck took 10 minutes to do anything. And he said, out of a long silence, what happens at 18. Diane said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Like, the day. Do I have to go that day, or is there a window?" Now Diane had known this conversation was coming since the day he arrived. She had rehearsed it in the shower. She had gotten it wrong in her head about 9 different ways. And what she actually said, sitting in a cold truck at a stoplight 2 miles from home, was, "Well, that is a paperwork question, and I do not care much for the answer." He said, "Okay." She said, "Owen, nobody is going anywhere on a birthday. That is not a thing that is going to happen in that house." And he said, "Okay," in a completely flat voice, because he had heard versions of that sentence 11 times. So Diane said the other thing. She said, "Do you want to talk about adoption?" The truck was doing about 35. He did not answer for 4 blocks. Then he said, "I am 17. That is stupid." She said, "It is not stupid. It is just uncommon." He said, "People adopt babies." And she said, "People adopt whoever they mean to keep." He pulled into the driveway and put the truck in park, and turned the key off. And they sat there in the dark, with the engine ticking. And he said, "Can I think about it?" And she said, "Take a year if you want." And he said, "Okay," and got out and went inside. He came back 8 days later. He came into the kitchen where she was doing a crossword, and he stood there with his hands in his sweatshirt pocket, and he said, "If we did that, do I have to change my name?" Diane said, "You do not have to do anything." He said, "But I could." She said, "You could." He said, "Okay," and he went out to the garage. That is how the biggest decision of a boy's life gets made in a house in Indiana. Standing in a kitchen, in a sweatshirt, in about 14 seconds, after 8 days of not sleeping. The rest of it was paperwork, and the paperwork took 6 months, which everybody told them was fast, and which was only fast because there was nothing left to litigate. I'm going to tell you about it plainly, because people always imagine there is a scene where a judge bangs a gavel and everyone cries. And there is. But there is also a filing fee. His mother's rights had been terminated 4 years earlier, so that hearing was already done, and Owen did not have to sit through any of it, which was the one mercy the calendar gave him. What was left was a petition, filed by an attorney Yvonne recommended, and Gary paid for out of a certificate of deposit that had been sitting in a credit union since the Clinton administration. There was an updated home study, which meant the woman came back out and looked at the water heater again. There was a criminal history check on 2 people in their 60s who had never so much as had a speeding ticket, which took 9 weeks because of a backlog. There was a court report. There was a hearing date that got moved twice. And there was a form, 1 page, in the middle of that stack, on which a 17-year-old had to write, in his own handwriting, that he consented to being adopted. Diane found him at the kitchen table at 10 at night, with that page in front of him and a pen in his hand and nothing written on it. He had been there an hour. She did not ask him what was wrong. She got a glass of water she did not want, and she sat down across from him and did the crossword. At about 11:30, he signed it and pushed it across the table and said, "Do not make a thing out of this." She said, "Wouldn't dream of it." The hearing was on a Tuesday in the middle of August at 10 in the morning, at the county courthouse, in a small courtroom on the second floor with radiators that clanked. Kevin flew in from Colorado. Steph drove up from Indianapolis and brought a camera and cried in the parking garage before they even got inside. Yvonne came, in the same gray blazer she had worn to every hearing for 10 years. Doyle came from the Career Center, 3 days into the new school year, on his prep period, in a shop apron he had forgotten to take off. Owen wore a tie that Gary tied for him in the hallway, because neither of them will admit to this day which one of them did not know how. The judge was a woman about Diane's age, who did probably 4 of these a month, and clearly loved every one of them. She read the petition. She asked the attorney the standard questions. It took less than 15 minutes. And then she took her glasses off and looked directly at the young man in the second chair and said, "Owen, you are 17 years old, and under the law of this state, that means nobody can do this to you. It only happens if you say yes. So I am going to ask you, on the record, and take as long as you like." The courtroom was very quiet. The radiator clanked. And Owen said, "Yes, ma'am." Then he said, "I would like to keep my middle name, if that is allowed." The judge said, "It is." So the order was entered, and the name went down as Owen, and then his mother's family name in the middle, the one Rhonda was born with, and then Mercer, which was Diane and Gary's. He kept both. I have thought about that a lot. He did not trade one family for the other. He put them in the same name and carried the whole thing forward, which is about the most generous thing a person who has been through what he had been through could possibly do. The judge came down off the bench for the photograph, which she does for all of them, and Steph took 41 pictures, and in every single one, Gary is looking at the boy instead of the camera. They went to a diner afterward, and Doyle had to leave early for 5th period. Kevin, who had been in the Army 13 years and had a jaw exactly like his father's, hugged his new brother in the parking lot with one arm, the way men do, and said something in his ear that nobody else heard, and that Owen has never repeated. And that afternoon, Diane went home and made the bed in the gray-blue room, and did not do one single thing differently, because nothing about that house had changed. A judge had simply written down what had been true since about the middle of the previous June. Now, here is what happened next, which is the part you have been waiting for, and which is the reason I wanted to tell you this one tonight. Owen Mercer is 25 years old. That is 8 years past that courtroom, and 9.5 past the trash bag in the driveway. He finished at the Career Center and walked across the stage in a gown, which Diane will tell you was the best day of her life, and Gary will tell you was fine, and then Gary will leave the room. He got his certification. He worked 4 years for a heating and cooling company out of Fort Wayne. And 2 years ago, he bought a used van and put his own name on the side of it. He is married. Her name is Jess. She is a dental hygienist, and she is the only person alive who can get away with calling him a soft touch. They have a daughter, Hattie, who is 3, and a son named Wes, who arrived in the fall, and who is, by all accounts, enormous. They live 4 streets over from Diane and Gary, not by accident. And every Sunday, unless there is weather, Owen mows his mother's lawn. That is the update. That is the whole thing. A 25-year-old man with 2 kids and a van with his name on it, pushing a mower across a yard he does not live in, while a 3-year-old runs through the sprinkler, and a woman in her 70s brings out iced tea nobody asked for. Gary is 73 now. He had a knee replaced last spring, and he has opinions about the physical therapist. And it was Owen who drove him to every appointment. because Owen took the mornings off and did not discuss it with anybody. Duke the Beagle made it to 15, which is a very good run for a beagle, and he is buried at the back of that property under a maple, and Owen dug the hole. And that was the only time in the entire 9.5 years that Diane saw that boy cry. Rhonda is 52. She is in a group home 2 hours south, and she is doing about as well as anybody in her situation does. And Owen brings the kids twice a year. Hattie calls her Grandma Rhonda. Diane made sure of that personally. And if you want to know what kind of woman we have been talking about for the last hour, that is the answer right there. And once a year, in the fall, the county holds a training and recruitment night for new foster parents, in a conference room with coffee in a carafe. And they ask Owen to speak. He hates it. He does it anyway. He stands up in front of 150 people who are thinking about doing what Diane did and who are terrified, and he does not tell them a tragedy. He tells them about a fuel line and a wire basket on a desk that got refilled on Sundays, and a woman who did not once ask him to unpack. And every year he says the same thing at the end, which are her words, not his, said in a doorway on a night in May by a woman who did not know she was saying anything important. He says, "The door on that room did not lock. She told me it never would. And she told me nobody was going to come through it at 11 at night and tell me to get up." And then, he says, for about 1.5 years, I laid there and waited for somebody to come through it anyway. And nobody ever did. That is it. That is the whole thing. You do not have to fix anybody. You just have to be the door that stays shut and unlocked at the same time for longer than they can hold their breath. The bag is still in the bottom drawer of that dresser. Hattie found it last summer, the way 3-year-olds find everything, and dragged it out into the hall, and asked her dad what it was. And Owen crouched down and took it from her, and folded it up again the way it had been, and said, "That is the bag I came here with." She asked why he kept it, and he said, "Because it is the last one I ever needed." So that is your story tonight. There is no villain in it. Nobody is punished. Nobody is exposed. Nobody stands up at a table and reads anybody the receipts. A boy arrives at 17 minutes past midnight with a trash bag, and a woman in a cardigan does not mention the bag. And then a great deal of nothing happens for a very long time, on purpose, until nothing is the safest thing he has ever been handed. That is what it is made of. Pancakes on a Saturday, whether anybody eats them or not. A light held over a mower deck. A basket that gets refilled without comment. A parking lot in January with the engine running. A door that does not lock. And right now, tonight, while you are lying there with the lamp off, a phone is ringing in a dark house somewhere in this country. There is a woman on one end with a list of names and nowhere left to send somebody. And there is a person on the other end, sitting up in bed, turning on a lamp, doing that arithmetic. Most of the time the answer is no, and that is not a crime, because people have their own lives and their own capacity, and nobody owes a stranger their spare room. But sometimes, in a ranch house, on a street where the same 9 families have traded snow shovels for 30 years, somebody says, "Tell her yes." Sleep well tonight. Let your shoulders come down off your ears. Picture a gray-blue room with a quilt on the bed, and a lamp on a desk, and an old deaf dog asleep across somebody's shins, and a door standing open on a hallway where nothing at all is going to happen tonight. That is as safe as a room gets. That one is yours until morning. I will see you in the next one. Before you drift off, Tell me something if you have it in you. Was Diane right to sit down next to him instead of promising him he would never be sent anywhere? Or would you have made the promise and meant it? And if somebody stayed for you once, when they did not have to, and you never quite got around to telling them what it did, tell me about them tonight. As always, drop your state and how old you are, so I know who is out there resting with me. Sleep well. The door is not locked, and nobody is coming through it.